Realm of Ink is one of several isometric action roguelites that has released this year with solid gameplay. It's clearly inspired by Hades, but it also differentiates itself enough to create a satisfying and enjoyable, unique game. So let's get into it. In Realm of Ink, you play as Red, a human blessed with fox blood and an ink pet follower. The world is heavily inspired by Chinese culture and themes. Within each run, you clear rooms of enemies or bosses, collect different passive effects for your builds, and collect ink gems to give you new abilities. Your moveset in Realm of Ink will be familiar to action roguelite fans. You have a light attack, a heavy attack, a dodge, and 2 active abilities in the form of ink gems. The core combat here feels fairly similar to games like Hades and other similar action roguelites. It's fast-paced, it's a bit attack spammy at times, and it relies on fun, but usually fairly simplistic combos between light attacks, heavy attacks, and those active abilities. I generally really enjoyed the combat here, and everything feels nice and responsive. Enemy attacks are also clearly telegraphed in a way that makes them feel fair to learn. It's worth noting, there is some auto-aiming in this game in regards to your ranged attacks in particular. They often just target the nearest enemy. Some abilities do have more manual aiming, but even those free aiming abilities often have some magnetic quality, while they will latch on to the nearest enemy closest to your target area. Generally, this auto-aiming was fine for me, but there are a couple times the game targets an enemy that isn't the one you want to focus on, and that was only really frustrating with one particular enemy in the final area. The game structure is also fairly standard for action roguelites, with enemies spawning in waves that must be killed in order to get a room reward and move on to the next room. Each area has a mini-boss and a final boss as well, with the shop area before both of them. Builds in Realm of Ink consist of your character and their ink brushes, your ink gems and corresponding ink pet, and your perks and elixirs. First, your moveset is determined by your character. There are around 10 characters in the game, and they all have fairly distinct movesets, ranging from fast versus slow attacks, ranged versus melee, more independent attacks versus light and heavy attacks that synergize or combo together closely. I really love the variety of characters here, and all their movesets are pretty easy to pick up, while also having unique qualities that are just fun to try and experiment with. There's a nice mix of characters that are very flexible and broad, like the starting character, and other characters that really synergize nicely with one specific build type, like one character that gets much more powerful with ink gem focused builds. Additionally, each character can collect different ink brushes after each final boss. These brushes are equivalent to hammers in Hades, and they modify the movesets in some form. For example, they might change the attack pattern of the light or heavy attack, they might improve some inherent mechanic, like stacking more character-specific resources, or they might add some additional mechanic that you can now manage and play around with. There are a shocking number of these brushes, and they range from simpler buffs to ones that can really change the feel and the playstyle of a weapon. I think this ink brush variety is definitely a stronger point of the builds. The next biggest area of the builds are the ink gems. You collect 2 of them along your run, and each ink gem has both passive abilities and an active skill. There are also 4 tiers or upgrades for each ink gem that slowly increase the power of these abilities and add new additional effects. Typically, the final tier is an especially powerful buff that adds a whole new mechanic. Each of these ink gems usually focus on one specific build type or maybe 2, but some of them are also more general buffs, like the one that increases silver gain that just generally helps you out buy more things in shops. I like the ink gems that are present, and there are some fun active abilities to use. At all times, you also have an ink pet. Which ink pet you have will change depending on the elemental type of your ink gems. And your pet gets more powerful as you level up those gems and gets an ultimate ability when you get high enough level gems. These abilities can range from a powerful ice storm that covers the map to another pet that spawns a mini volcano and damages enemies that way. Honestly, these pets are often not a core element of the build, they're kind of incidental, but the ultimate abilities are always fun, and having a pet is just always cool. The game has a moderate amount of passive stacking elements that come in the form of perks and elixirs. Perks are more unique buffs, like making enemies around your character burn, or making light attacks slowly gain crit chance as you keep attacking, things like that. Elixirs, on the other hand, are all more direct stat increases, like increased crit chance, increased health, or increased ink gem recharge rate. Elixirs are fairly uninteresting, they're just small stat increases, but I think they fit as a nice filler reward and just another smaller way to flesh out those builds. Perks, on the other hand, can be very powerful buffs, and as a result of that, they can really be the cornerstone of builds, especially the higher tier perks. For example, if you have a bleed focus build, most of those bleeding effects are coming from your perks, and maybe 1 ink gem, 2 if you're lucky. As a whole, I like how these pieces fit together to form builds. There are distinct pieces to play around with, but the core build elements are also not super complicated. You have attacks, you have your ink gem abilities, and you have passive stacking in different forms. And while the core ideas are fairly simple, each of these systems has some good depth, good playstyle variety, some fun things to experiment with and play around with. Finishing up this section with a couple gameplay odds and ends. It's worth noting that later stages can have some visual clutter, where you have a bunch of effects and passives that stack up, all trigger, and just create a lot of noise. Also, while the gameplay generally feels great, there are occasional times where the game seems to not register certain button presses. I mostly noticed this on 1 or 2 characters, including the starting character's heavy attacks. I think this problem comes around because there's no skill queuing system, and some abilities have longer aftercast animations. So sometimes I press the heavy attack to charge it up, and it wouldn't do anything because some old animation, either a light attack or a dodge, just hasn't finished yet. So that heavy attack wouldn't queue, but also wouldn't activate and interrupt that first animation. Or at least I think that's what the problem was. I had a similar problem sometimes with picking up or equipping some ink gems. Honestly, these problems were pretty rare and they were very minor. It mostly led to me taking a couple extra hits on those 1 or 2 characters, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Steam Deck wise, this game runs super well. It's a fun Steam Deck game, though things can be a little small on the screen in regards to reading item descriptions, things like that. I did quite a few runs in the Steam Deck and I had a great time with it. I did have 1 crash, which didn't make me lose progress, but it did make the in-game record system forget my Steam Deck runs that happened before the crash. I still kept my current progression and difficulty levels, so it was a more minor bug, but again, also worth mentioning. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Realm of Ink. I've already praised the build crafting in a general sense, but I also think it does well in that variety and randomness category. There are just a lot of different viable build types. There are 3 different condition effects that have their own builds, multiple enemy debuffs you can play around with, light or heavy attack focus builds, ink pet focus builds, magic circles, perk special effects, shield buffs, and just so much more that shine with those specific combos of ink gems, perk, and whatever character and moveset you're using. You do often have more than one category of build, so you might focus on multiple condition effects at once, or you might have a light attack and condition effect build, which I guess both helps and hurts the variety in some sense, but just something to keep in mind. I think the perks are especially great with some of those unique effects and how they combo together with the ink gems. I do also enjoy the ink gems, but that's probably the area that needs the most variety for me. There are 21 or so ink gems currently, but it really feels like every build type has only 2 or maximum 3 ink gems that really work with them specifically. Again, there are a couple more general ink gems, like that silver gain one, but I think adding some more ink gems to just give more variety for each build type is the main thing that I want from this game, variety-wise, in order to improve it. Randomness-wise, in terms of that RNG, I think you can always find builds that work, and even runs that start out really weak can end up incredibly powerful later on. I had one run where several boss fights in a row, I was 1 hit away from dying, but I ended that run with the build that killed the final boss in under 30 seconds on the hardest difficulty, because of how those future perks and ink gems changed up my build and how powerful I got later on. While I usually didn't try to force builds, you definitely can force a category of build if you really want to. As I've said before, there aren't that many ink gems, so you can always find an ink gem for a certain build if you want to. Because a couple of the characters really preference 1 or 2 specific build types, those characters really benefit from that smaller ink gem pool. You also always have a choice of perks and elixirs, and you very quickly get a generous amount of rerolls as well. So this game fits a nice balance of RNG and counter RNG measures. There are also various NPCs you encounter along the way that give you some more fun, RNG, and risk-reward choices as well. Once you've done a certain number of runs, an additional counter RNG measure is unlocked as well at the start of each run. At the cost of Foxblood, a cross-run currency that we'll talk about in a second, you can select a starting gem and perk to get your build off in a certain direction. I didn't actually do this very much because 1, the Foxblood costs don't let you always do it, and 2, I like to go with the flow build crafting wise more often than not. I like to play around with what I have and try to experiment that way. But this counter RNG measure is a fun tool if you really want to force a certain build even more than the game typically allows. On the enemy side, I think the different areas have good variety both thematically, but also in terms of mechanics. The enemies all have different flavors and attack patterns. Enemies can also be elite or more powerful enemies that have additional effects as well, like new attack patterns or spawning additional AoEs for you to dodge. This adds a little more variety room to room and run to run as well. Boss-wise, I actually quite like the bosses in this game. I think they have a good amount of variety between them, and like the different attack patterns that they employ. There are currently no alternative bosses or boss variants, and while I don't think the game strictly needs those things, more boss variety can only be a good thing for replayability. So, as a whole, I think Realm of Ink has good run-from variety and a nice mix of RNG elements and elements that can be controlled. Build crafting wise, the number of ink gems is the biggest flaw for me and does hold the build crafting back some. Otherwise, I think the variety as a whole is good. Now let's talk about progression and replayability in Realm of Ink. Realm of Ink has a good mix of horizontal and vertical progression systems. Talking about that horizontal or variety-focused progression first, you unlock the ability to play with more characters or movesets by unlocking these movesets with the gemstone currency you get by beating bosses on runs. As I've already talked about, I like the variety of the characters, and the pacing of the unlocks is also pretty fast. I unlocked at least one new character after each run, and often more than one. You need to choose which characters you want to unlock first, which ones you want to prioritize. Next is the main vertical progression system, or upgrades that make you more powerful run to run. As you go on runs and defeat enemies, you get a second currency called Foxblood. You use this currency in a skill tree to unlock a variety of different buffs that are both general and build specific. It has a nice mix of cheaper upgrades, like slightly more health, and more powerful and expensive upgrades, like one free revive per run. If you like progression in roguelites, this has a good mix of choices and player preference, mixed with a couple of restrictions and classic skill tree upgrade pathing. In a more minor capacity, you can also upgrade the strength of your ink pet, which makes it more powerful and unlocks a couple fun skins for it. The game currently has 5 difficulty levels, and each difficulty level basically just adds some stat buffs to enemies, like increased health or harder hitting attacks. They also buff the Foxblood that you gain from runs as well. These difficulty levels aren't super creative, but they work well for the game. At its core, Realm of Ink is not super challenging, especially when you max out that skill tree. So it's a great game that really requires these difficulty levels. That being said, I can pretty reliably beat and clear the highest difficulty right now, even when trying out new characters and different build types for the first time. I'm generally good at action roguelites, but I'm also not that great at them. So if you're looking for a harder challenge, you probably won't get that from Realm of Ink, because the hardest difficulty just isn't that hard right now. I think it's also worth noting that the power difference between a great build and a bad build is pretty huge. This means that in the later areas at the higher difficulties, it can get really tedious and enemies can be really tanky if you have a bad build. But that's also just a bit of a skill issue at some point, because good build can absolutely melt all enemies, kill them super fast, and as we've already talked about, it's pretty much always possible to get at least a decent build with what you're given. So progression-wise, Realm of Ink has a good amount of all those progression types without ever being super grindy. You unlock new characters and movesets at a very reasonable pace. I completed the vertical progression tree in about 12 to 13 hours, which is probably on the shorter to medium side of those systems. The main progression area that needs more work, in my opinion, is adding more difficulty levels, because I've already capped out the challenge there, and we'll talk about that in the early access section. Realm of Ink has good narrative underpinnings and a lot of lore entries for you to explore as you unlock them. The game has you playing as Red, a human blessed with Foxblood, who's setting out to defeat some evil spirit that's taking over the world and removed self-determination. Along the way, you fight the spirit's minions. You meet a host of characters in the Fox Sanctuary, which is your home base, and you also meet a cast of enemy bosses that support the evil spirit in various forms. Each of these characters, as well as their different areas, have lore entries that reveal themselves with time. There's voice-acted dialogue as well, but it's exclusively in Chinese. This game is generally very well translated, though, through the writing. I like the story as a whole, and I like the amount of story elements present. I think it's missing a little something to make that story more memorable, but it's pretty enjoyable for a roguelite. A main annoyance is that there aren't that many dialogue options for each character, so they start repeating themselves pretty quickly. But they still have that new dialogue like box above their heads, which made me disappointed when I talked to those characters and expected new dialogue. So as a whole, Realm of Ink is on the better end for narrative and story in roguelites, but still not quite at Hades-like level that you might hope for. Realm of Ink is currently in early access, and I want to talk about a handful of early access related things. Honestly, this game is already in a great place, and it feels like a complete game already. There are a couple more things that I want to be added, and many of them are already on their roadmap. The roadmap in place has their 1.0 release in January of next year, only a couple months away, and notably, it includes monthly updates with more ink gems, 2 more difficulty levels, and more special perks to improve that build crafting even more. They also have a new area and boss plan for the final release, and I'm pretty excited to try that out. They also mentioned some free DLC planned for post 1.0 release, so we'll see what those are in the future. In short, I don't think there's a need to wait for the game. It feels great already. It already feels pretty complete. There's no obvious omissions, but it's also coming to 1.0 pretty soon either way, so if you want to wait for that, it's not a long wait. So what's my verdict on Realm of Ink? Overall, I really loved it. It's a solid action roguelite with good core combat, enjoyable enemies and bosses, and fun build crafting with many different builds. I've gotten quite a few runs out of it, and while it is early access, it does feel mostly feature complete. There are still a couple areas where I'd really love to see some improvement for that 1.0 full release. The main things are, I want more ink gems for more build variety. They do have some more planned right now, but I hope they increase that number of ink gems even more. Additionally, the game definitely needs more difficulty levels for me to keep playing it, since I feel like I've already surpassed the maximum challenge that this game has to offer quite a few times. Finally, I think some smaller things like boss variants or alternative mini-bosses could be added, which just gives more variety. But those are more minor things that I don't think need to be there. At its core, if you like action roguelites like Hades, I think Realm of Ink is a safe bet of a game you will enjoy. It does a good job of drawing inspirations from the greats while still forming its own identity. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me on the algorithm, and thanks for watching.